Now, the floating disease and its opposite, the crushing disease, are just a couple of the things that humans face in this story. What was it about these situations that sparked your curiosity and your amusement?
Well, I just wanted to create a world gone wrong. I mean that world in which the ordinary rules don't seem to apply anymore. And randomly don't apply. So you never know when the law of gravity is going to cease to exist. And I just thought that was a way of dramatizing a thing that I kind of actually feel about the world, that it's going through a very bewildering moment, and so I invented this idea of the strangenesses, where there was a world in which randomly strange things would befall people
Yeah.
without any explanation. And I mean, part of the explanation has to do with these supernatural beings, but most people don't know that for a long time.
Now, lots of wonderfully horrible and unexpected things happen in this time of strangenesses. What are some of your personal favorites?
Oh, I like the storm baby a lot, who has the power of not only of detecting corruption, but of having the corruption show up on people's faces, which actually begin to rot because they're corrupt. I liked her. I thought she was cool.
Well, we all kind of feel like babies can detect corruption, don't we?
Yes, exactly. But when they actually make you burst out in boils and sores, well, they can do that too, of course. But anyway, yes, I like the storm baby. I like my graphic novelist Jimmy Kapoor, who actually was one of those characters who was never supposed to be a big character. I mean, I thought of him very much as supporting cast.
Okay.
But when I started writing him, he just became too enjoyable, to get rid of, and so he became bigger and bigger in the book. I mean, I think he's still a kind of second-rank character in the book, but he became one of the more entertaining for me to do.
You seem to have a lot of fun with the absurd.
Yes,
What do you think that says about you?
Well, I think it makes me one of the people who doesn't buy the ordinary shape of the world. I mean, it seems to me the shape of the world does break down all the time. And the absurd, I mean, the theater of the absurd was something I was very fond of when I was younger, the plays of Ionesco and Beckett and so on, just showing how ridiculous human life actually is. And I've always, I think, carried that with me.
And you said this might be your funniest book.
Well, I mean, just based on what people are saying to me, I mean, I hope there's some humor in everything I've written, because, as a reader, I don't really respond very well to books that have no humor in them at all. So I would hope that as a writer, there's always some. But this one, yeah, people have been accusing it of making them laugh out loud, which is a good feeling.
I think if you naturally see a lot of humor in the world, a book that doesn't have much humor probably doesn't resonate with you as real.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think it's a good way of approaching the world, actually, even very dark subjects. It's sometimes best approached through black comedy rather than just darkness.
Do you think that indicates something to you more than just that this book is entertaining, if it's inspired so much of your sense of humor?
Yeah, I mean, I think something happened with this book. I'm not exactly sure what, but it just took off and flew in some way, and it wrote itself a lot of the time. I mean, it took me about. I mean, the scary thing is, it took me just about the length of time to write that is in the title.
Wow!
And I only just worked that out actually a few days ago. But it took me less than 3 years and more than 2.5. So it took me about 2 years, 8 months and a bit.
Magical indeed.
And about half of that time was taken working it out, because it has lots of different storylines and so on, and I had to make them all work together. But once I felt that I knew what I was doing, it really just wrote itself. And
Interesting.
It's always the best feeling for a writer when the book just seems to be coming out of you.
How rare is that experience?
It's much rarer than I would like it to be. I mean, every so often you get a little bit, like a passage that you're writing, which just seems to come very naturally.
But this is almost the whole thing.
This is almost the whole thing.
Wow.
Yeah,
Once it was conceptualized.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it took me about 1.5 years to to feel that I was kind of in charge of it. But after that, yeah, it just rushed out.
That's got to be a good sign. 2 years, 8 months, and 28 nights add up to 1,001 nights. That was an inspiration for this story. I understand it's your desert island pick as well.
Yes, once upon a time, yeah.
Do you remember the first time you read it?
Well, of course, I heard a lot of the stories before I read the book because I heard them in children's versions, from my parents as kids' stories. Because the book is not written for children. I mean, the book is really quite complicated in language and very much written for adult readers. So by the time I read the real book, I was grown up. But it's one of those books. I mean, nobody ever really reads the book straight through because it's so huge, But you kind of dip into it and read a story here and a story there.
Yeah.
And I still do that. I still go back in every so often and check it out.
There are stories within stories, stories that people's very lives depend on. I can imagine why that captured your imagination. You say more beautiful is the story of the storyteller.
Yeah,
Why?
well, of course, the most famous thing about the 1001 Nights is the frame story, the story of Shahrazad being married to this king who's been murdering his wives one a night, and she, first of all, saves her life by telling him stories that he wants to hear the end of. And secondly, over the course of the 1001 Nights, the storytelling actually makes him a better person. She actually civilizes him through the act of storytelling. And that's kind of a very beautiful idea, that stories might have the power to make their readers better people. Especially in this case, the audience, he's a tyrant and mass murderer, but by the end of the story, I'm not quite sure why in the story I could get why he falls in love with her. I don't quite get why she falls in love with him, because he's murdered thousands of women.
It's so amazing when you can encounter a book as a child and it stays with you for the rest of your life.
Yes, very much so.
Does that capture your imagination about that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the wonderful things about growing up in where I did in India is that there is this huge storehouse of not just fairy tales, but what are called wonder tales, kind of fables that are just available to you. And I, of course, I did encounter. My first encounter was really my father telling me and my sisters bedtime stories, his versions of this. And then as you grow up, there are picture books, like comic books, which tell some of these stories. And gradually, as you become a better reader, you can read the actual texts. But they've stuck with me all my life, and I think they have, not just in this book. I think from the beginning, they've shaped a lot about how I see the business of writing.
Can I get you to tell one of the stories in your novel? Maybe the one about the story parasites.
Well, there's just one of the characters in the novel is a storyteller, and she shows up at like story slams in New York and tells tales. There's a version of the moth in the novel, which is called the locusts. But anyway, she has this story about this African tribe, which becomes obsessed with the idea that there's a thing called a story parasite, which gets into children through their ears and then makes them demand stories. And then the result of the stories is to make them think all kinds of unsuitable thoughts. And so the elders decide that they have to cure this disease of the story parasite by stopping up the ears of babies, with mud so that they can't hear anything. And what that does is derange them. Everybody, the tribe goes insane, basically. And it does not end well. But that was just a little fable about how important stories are to us as human beings. That when we're born, of course, the first things that babies need is to feel that they're nourished and loved and safe, and housed. But once those basic needs are met, the next need that comes up is tell me a story. And the desire for once upon a time, is profound and is there from the earliest times in our lives.
I'm led to contemplate the value of story versus the value of rationalism.
Yeah, well, it is. I mean, it's interesting. They're two very different ways of attacking the same thing. I mean, both things are trying to understand. Both processes are trying to understand who we are as human beings and how we function and what we do to each other and so on. But story, of course, can do it through make-believe, whereas reason has to use only, what is concrete and tangible.
Yeah. No humor.
Not much humor in rationalism, but lots of humor in fiction. Yeah. I mean, and there are contradictions in it. I mean, I think, I think of myself as a person, a rational person, and so on, and yet I write all these stories full of goblins and fairies, which is, it's kind of a contradiction. But it's because I think that other way of telling, the storytelling way of telling, is something that just I fell in love with from the earliest times, and I've always seen that as just as useful a way towards the truth as rational argument.
Mm-hmm. And of course, science is also a kind of story as well. A graph is a story. Okay, your novel begins with a great storm, which feels disturbingly timely. Do you see recent terrifying acts of weather entering our collective conscious in a new way?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's happening is that, I always remember when I first came to America being very surprised that there was a thing called the Weather Channel. People were actually watching the weather as if it was television programming, and that seemed odd. But what's happened in the 15 years or so that I've been living in New York is that the weather has become the weather's become much bigger in our consciousness, because the weather, the acts of weather to which we're all victim, are on such a larger scale. Whether it's hurricanes or floods or typhoon, I mean, there's all kinds of things happening all over the world. Tsunamis in one place, hurricanes in another, and I mean, it's part of what this book tries to get into is this idea of the world going wrong, and a part of that does have to do with the environment and with the imbalance in the ecological structure of the planet,
And not just on the Weather Channel, but also in literature, also in popular culture, we're seeing more apocalyptic scenarios.
Yeah, because I think everybody's being very startled by the way in which the world is. I don't know. I was going to say misbehaving, but actually maybe we're the ones who've been misbehaving, and the world is getting even.
That's what a lot of people think.
Yeah. I mean, and there are characters in the book who think that, who think that this is the planet reacting against the disease, which is the human race.
And one of your genies notes that humans have a special talent for ignoring impending doom.
Yes,
which is true. Psychologists would verify that.
We're very, very good at it.
Yeah.
But also, what human beings also have, which the genie doesn't say, is a very, very powerful survival instinct. And that when the impending doom actually does come and smack you in the face, human beings, I would bet on them to come up with solutions. I mean, I'm not in that sense completely a doom monger. I don't believe it's all over. I think
the sense of urgency activates something for us.
It does. We do something, but only when it's almost too late.
That's one of the most annoying things about human nature.
Yeah, nobody does it in advance. It's like kids who won't do their homework until the 11th hour.
Yeah, your subconscious mind has calculated how much time you need, the minimum amount of time,
exactly,
and it will only let you.
It'll only do that.
Yeah. Do you have an extreme weather experience of your own that got you thinking about this?
Well,
stuff?
I was in New York for Sandy. And I was in the blackout and all that. And it was strange because the previous year there had been another hurricane warning for Hurricane Irene, which was supposed to be terrible, and then at least in Manhattan it turned out to be really not much, just sort of a bad rain, And so then we were all told that Sandy was coming and that it was going to be like that. And we all thought, well, we remember when people warned us about Irene, and we remember that was really nothing. So don't worry about it. This is going to be fine. And then of course it was really not fine.
Yeah.
And yes, I mean, I was there in the blackout for just 4 days and nights, but that's a lot.
That's enough to shake you up.
It's enough to, make you really think about what's going on, especially when, we discover that the reason for the power outage was that the water, the rivers rose to a level that they'd never, ever risen to in the history of New York City. So even though there were flood protection walls, very high flood protection walls around the power stations, the water rose 4 feet higher than the flood protection walls.
Wow.
And flooded and so the stations had to be shut down. I mean, I think at that point you begin to think we live on an island here, it's surrounded by water, and this could be really quite serious.
Side note, my parents are from Rwanda, and when we came here, they also noted that people talk about the weather a lot in the Strangers of the Weather Channel. But there it's because it's 25 and sunny every day.
Yeah, exactly.
There's nothing to talk
Exactly,
about.
but nobody talks about the weather in Los Angeles.
Yeah, yeah.
because there's no weather unless there's an earthquake. There's nothing to talk about.
Yeah.
And people always used to make jokes about the British, that the British are always talking about the weather, but actually, I think Americans are beginning to do it more.
The magical baby named Storm. Was that inspired by the real life baby Storm, by the way? Do you know who that is?
No, I don't know who that is. Who is that?
That was a child that made a lot of news here in Toronto, being raised without his parents locking into, his or her parents locking into gender.
Oh.
And there's some discussion of that.
Oh, right. No,
in your novel.
I just accidentally reinvented. Sorry, I didn't know about that. No, this was just the baby's called Storm because she's a foundling. Who survived the storm with which the novel begins.
Interesting. What got you thinking about those gender issues? There's an infinity of sexes in your novel.
Well, I mean, that's another subject that's just become much more front and center, in recent years.
Yeah.
That people are talking about it and thinking about it. And so, I think one of the things you have to do as a novelist is to have your ear to the ground. You have to try and keep attuned to what is really happening in people's minds. I mean, the novel is really the opposite of an ivory tower form. You have to think how do people talk these days? What words do they use, and what TV shows do they watch, and what is the stuff in their heads? So I try and keep your ear to the ground.
Is that pure research for you? You reference reality TV. Is that pure research for you, or are you a fan?
No, I hate reality TV. Yeah. I mean, it would take a lot to make me watch it.
Yeah.
But I have like turned it on for like 3 minutes and run to the bathroom in disgust.
Do you remember what the show was?
Oh, well, I've watched some of those shows with people beginning with K.
It's so interesting to have this novel looking from the future back upon these times and things like reality TV.
Yeah, that was kind of for me, that was the thing that made the book work when I had that idea. That was a kind of open sesame moment because I wanted a way of writing about the present that was a mixture of fact and myth and fable and so on. And I thought, well, if we sitting here now were to look back 1,000 years to the year 1000, that's sort of how we remember that time. We have some historical facts, but then we also have lots of just fables and folk tales, which get mixed up with history.
And I love how much that is sort of genre-based too. And so if people were to look back from 1,000 years back on us, our popular culture would be this sort of genre.
Yes, exactly.
Superheroes.
The question is what survives, and it's very difficult to know 1,000 years from now what will survive.
Yeah.
And it's not at all necessarily going to be high art that survives.
Absolutely, yeah.
I mean, there's already we can see that there's pop songs which in their day were considered to be like bubblegum trash, but which actually have been the ones that everybody still listens to.
Have become very influential.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, Sugar, Sugar. Who would have thought that anybody like 50 years later would still even know what that was?
Well, I actually spoke with a poet last spring, Kathleen Ossip, and she said that celebrities today are basically like Greek gods. And to her, that's not a bad thing.
Well, I mean, I know what she means. I mean, I think what I don't know whether it's celebrities, but I think what's certainly true is that popular culture has come to be the kind of point of reference that we can use in the way that in earlier generations people could use mythology. People could talk about the myth of Orpheus, say, and they would know that their audience would know what they're talking about. Whereas now we can use singers in that way. Actually exist. So yeah, it's true that every time has its own frame of reference, and this is ours.
Do you think we can still derive the same sort of core moral themes and messages from our?
No, it's more degraded, I have to say.
What do you think that will mean 1,000 years from now?
Well, maybe they'll look back on us as a degraded time.
You're a well-known person. You've experienced the best and worst of celebrity culture personally. What's that been like for you?
It's all right. I mean, you know, it gets you tables in restaurants, gets you seats at Yankee Stadium. You know, beyond that, it's not. I mean, I'm not. You know, it's not like being Taylor Swift or something. You know, I mean, if I walk down the street, nobody runs after me screaming. So
You can live.
I can have a private life. I mean, and every so often, you know, I'm sort of in some kind of spotlight. But it's for a writer, most of your life is very private. I mean, most of your life is sitting in a room, turning inwards, trying to find your work. And if you don't do that, the books don't get written. You know, so it doesn't matter how well known you are.
And when people do know you, if you're a writer, they know you for your work.
Yeah, exactly.
And your ideas.
Exactly. And what happens to me, which is very nice, is people come up and say something nice about a book of mine that they've liked, etc. And that is actually very rewarding because writers don't encounter their readers that often. You know, it's not like being in a theater where you can see an audience there and you know how they're reacting.
Yeah.
You know, if you're a writer, the reaction is happening somewhere else in somebody else's private space. So if every so often you are able to meet your readers, it's always very rewarding.
And you've said the work of writing is very humbling.
Yeah.
Also,
yeah.
so getting some of that encouragement.
Because you know, all of us except one person are not Shakespeare. And he's dead. So there is that thing that happens all the time where you run up against the limits of your own talent. You know, and you want to make something happen on a page, and it's just not happening.
I think that's unique to writing, actually, because most crafts and even art, when you're good at it, you can just perform that skill. Whereas art, you kind of have to constantly confront
you have to
bad writing, frankly.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, writing is just, I mean, it's the hardest thing that I've ever found to do, you know, but it's also, of course, when it does work, it's very exhilarating.
You've said that you feel like we're living in a time of strangenesses. Right now, celebrity culture is a prime example, but also a lot of things are in flux.
Yes, the rate of change is faster than it's ever been.
Do you think we'll move away from some of these things?
Well, I mean, I think we're moving so fast that we leave things behind all the time. You know, if you consider the fate of the fax machine.
But some of these degraded things, as we've described them,
you
celebrity
mean, yes.
culture.
I hope so. Yeah. I hope so. I mean, I think there's some evidence. Actually, I was just reading in the paper this morning that some article which said that reality TV might have run its course and that people are less interested than they used to be and so on. And I mean, the point about that is it became popular for the makers of it because it's cheap. You know, it's a really cheap way of filling the airwaves. And then it just makes, quotes, stars, unquotes, out of people who are absolutely unequipped to handle that. You know, and so there's a lot of crash and burn. And I
that's
think,
good for our business, but yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, I think that I think it's a fad. You know, I think some of it might last because some of the shows are not as bad as others, but I don't think the way in which you can have entire networks composed only of that, you know, I think that may be a short-lived thing.
All of this leads to a question a lot of us struggle with, a question I think the novel raises too, which is, are we in a civilization in decline? Or is there something brighter ahead?
Yeah, I mean, I wonder about that too. I mean, I do think that what is true is that we have lost a kind of seriousness. You know, that there is. I mean, it seems boring and kind of grandfatherly to say it, but there's something important about engaging with ideas and having a strong ethical conversation going on in a society. You know, so that the society can constantly discuss what kind of society it wants to be. You know, and that's a way to have a rich society that can progress. And I think this kind of bread and circuses society that we've got, which is all kind of, you know, it's all celebrity culture, which is basically a way of distracting people from life. I think that there are problems in that. But I still think, you know, we shouldn't forget it, that we live in the lucky corner of the world. You know, that this bit of the world, North America, Western Europe, you know, is basically the bit where most of the money is and most of the freedom is. And in much of the rest of the world, people are much more restricted and live in much harsher conditions. So, we are the lucky ones, and I think we should just do our best to cherish it.
Yeah. And I think you're absolutely right. Distraction is public enemy number one
Yeah.
here.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so much of what is called the culture now, which is really just a way of distracting us from what's really happening.
Yeah. And we call it culture.
Yeah, and it's not culture. I mean, culture involves deep knowledge and subtlety and engagement and history and so on. It's not just turning on the TV and watching somebody slag off their boyfriend.
Yeah, yeah. What pop culture are you a fan of? What pop culture sort of fits that criteria?
Oh, I mean, I listen to music a lot. I mean, I am a child of my generation, so I listen to old music.
Well, I was surprised to see a reference to Das Racist in there.
Yes, well, that's because I met him, DJ Heems. I met him in New York and at a kind of at an Asian writers workshop thing, and I thought he was incredibly smart, and he wanted to write. He was trying to write books, and so he asked if I'd hang out with him. So we had drinks a couple of times and discussed writing. So yes, I mean, suddenly I have my rapper friend in Queens. Yeah.
But I interrupted you. There were some singers from your day that you admire.
Well, I mean, look, I'm the child of the '60s, and that's my problem, So, so I'm a kind of Bob Dylan kind of guy.
I should note that this book is actually quite entertaining and hopeful as well. It's not all doom and gloom.
Yes, because I thought, it's really true that it would be so easy right now, looking at the news and all that, to write a book where everything's terrible and then it gets worse, and then there's an awful ending. And I thought, and I know that this kind of dystopic fiction, so-called, is kind of quite popular even in the world of, of comic books and graphic novels and so on. There's a lot of dystopia around, and I thought, well, because of that, let me see about what we could do if we didn't do that. I mean, how else could we imagine things going, which was not just getting worse and worse and worse? And so that's, I mean, of course it's a fiction. I mean, it's an act of, if you like, positive imagining. So how could the world not have the fate that it looks as if it might be going to?
Yeah, was that a challenge? Was that hard to imagine?
Very hard. Yeah, very hard to make it convincing, even make it convincing to myself, before I could make it convincing to you. But I remembered, when I was studying history, which was my university subject, one of the things you learn from studying history is that history is not inevitable. It's not like on tram lines. It makes very unexpected moves very suddenly. And so you can't assume that because it's going in a certain direction at the moment, that it will inevitably go on going in that direction. And so I thought, okay, let me imagine a strange knight's move that takes it like in a completely different direction. And if you think about it, for instance, if in January of 1989, I had said to you, the Soviet Union will not exist at Christmas, you would have thought I'd mad, because it seemed like that's there and solid. But it just went boom, fell over in a matter of weeks. Yeah. And that's the way in which things, because we do live, as we were saying, we live in this time of incredibly rapid change. So when the change comes, it can come at bewildering speed.
And do you think that change begins with imagination, begins with story?
Well, I think, we have to dream the future before we can have the future.
Yeah.
I think if you're not imagining a better world, you can't bring it into being. So yes, I do.
Okay, before I let you go, I have to ask you this. If you could intervene and play the role of the genie, one of your genies, what would you do? What would you change about human culture?
Oh, my God. How would I fix the world?
You have one play.
I have one play. How would I fix the world? Well, I mean, look, let me offer a very old lefty idea, which is the redistribution of wealth. You have a country like the United States or India, where a tiny percentage of the country possesses almost all the wealth. And that's a very, very sick country. I mean, it just is, because all kinds of problems flow out of that. And that discredited philosopher Karl Marx said that that was a bad idea.
That's well, this current state that you just described is something I could imagine in 1,000 years we look back and say, was that real or was that a myth?
Exactly, exactly. And that's exactly what I wanted the book to have, that kind of feeling about, can we really be doing this to ourselves? You know?
Thank you so much.
Thank you.